The cockpit door burst open, and the first officer's face was the color of ash. But the person they needed wasn't a pilot. She was a 63-year-old retired air traffic controller sitting in row 27, eating a cold ham sandwich, and nobody on that aircraft knew she had spent 15 years guiding military jets through emergencies she was never supposed to talk about. Flight 417 from Frankfurt to Buenos Aires was 4,000 kilometers from anywhere. The captain was incapacitated. The first officer's hands were shaking too hard to work the radios, and the woman in row 27 had just closed her eyes and started counting backward from 10. Before we go any further, drop a comment below. What country are you watching from? I read every single one. And if this is the kind of story you came here for, subscribe. There are more coming. This is the story of what happens when the person who knows how to listen is the only one who can save you. Margaret Hoffman was exactly the kind of passenger you don't notice. She wore sensible shoes. Her gray hair was cut short because she didn't want to deal with it. She traveled alone, carried one small suitcase, and told the flight attendant she didn't need anything except maybe a glass of water later. Thank you, dear. To everyone around her, she was somebody's grandmother flying south for the winter. The young German couple across the aisle had already decided she was probably a retired school teacher or maybe a librarian. The man in the window seat next to her, a Hamburg contractor named Klaus, had tried to make small talk exactly once about the weather over the Atlantic, and received such brief, polite answers that he assumed she wasn't interested in conversation. What none of them saw was the way Margaret's eyes tracked every crew movement with the patience of someone who had spent decades watching things other people missed. When the flight attendant walked past with the coffee pot, Margaret noticed how her left hand gripped the handle a half-second longer than her right. When the captain's voice came over the PA for the routine welcome announcement, Margaret heard the slight breathiness in his third syllable, the kind of vocal fatigue that meant he'd been talking too much on the ground or sleeping too little the night before. She filed both observations away without thinking about them. Old habits. In her lap, she held a small leather-bound notebook. Her husband had given it to her 23 years ago, before he died. She wrote everything in it: grocery lists, phone numbers, the names of flowers she saw on walks. But tucked between the pages, written in a different hand entirely, were notes from her last day at Rhine Control Center. Frequency assignments, emergency checklists, a reminder to herself, when you stop hearing what isn't being said, you're already dangerous. She settled back into her seat as the plane climbed through 10,000 meters. The seatbelt sign clicked off. The cabin began to stir with the small movements of people relaxing into a long flight. She did not know she would need that notebook before the sun came up. Margaret Hoffman had not always been invisible. For 15 years, she sat in a darkened room in a concrete building outside Karlsruhe, surrounded by radar screens and radio equipment, and she talked military pilots through the worst moments of their lives. She was a controller in the German Air Force's Air Traffic Control Center, the person who guided fighter jets through emergencies, who talked panicked lieutenants down through thunderclouds, who heard the moment in a pilot's voice when they stopped believing they would make it home. She never flew an airplane, she never wanted to, but she could read a radar return the way a musician reads sheet music, and she could hear things in a human voice that the pilots themselves didn't know they were saying. The training had been brutal. 3 years of learning not just the hardware but the psychology, how fear changes the pitch of a voice, how exhaustion flattens tone into something that sounds calm but isn't, how silence on the radio is sometimes the loudest warning you will ever get. Her instructor, a retired controller named Dieter Wagner who had worked the night shift through the Cold War, had a single phrase he repeated until Margaret dreamed about it. The voice tells you everything. Learn to listen or learn to live with the bodies. She still remembered the first time he made her sit in the simulator with the lights off and identify pilots solely by their breathing patterns. She thought it was ridiculous. Then she did it, correctly, every time, and realized she had been hearing those patterns for years without knowing what she was listening to. Dieter had lost a pilot once, a young woman in a tornado whose engine flamed out at night over the Baltic. She'd been calm on the radio, professional, by the book. But Dieter heard something in her final transmission that he couldn't prove, couldn't explain. A tiny shift in her cadence that he later said was the sound of someone who had already decided they were going to die. He'd spent the next 20 years trying to figure out what he should have said differently. "You will lose someone," he told Margaret on her last day of training. "That's not the question. The question is whether you will hear them before they stop speaking." She never lost a pilot. Not one. In 15 years, through engine failures, hydraulic losses, fires, and one unforgettable night when a pilot ejected into the North Sea, and she kept talking to him for 47 minutes until the rescue helicopter's radio finally found his signal. Through all of that, every single person who took off under her watch landed again. But it cost her. The marriage she didn't have. The children she told herself she didn't want. The friendships that faded because she was always working, always listening, always waiting for the next voice on the radio that needed something only she could give. Dieter retired in 2008. Margaret retired in 2015, a year after her husband died of pancreatic cancer. A diagnosis she heard in the way his voice changed when he said, "I'm fine," and that she could do absolutely nothing about. Now she flew south every winter because the cold made her joints hurt, and because being somewhere that wasn't Germany made it easier to pretend she wasn't waiting for a radio that would never speak to her again. The man in 27C had no idea any of this was happening inside her head. He saw an old woman eating a sandwich. That was about to save his life. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner cruised at 37,000 feet, its wings cutting through air so cold that frost formed in patterns along the leading edges. Outside the windows, the sky was the deep blue-black of high altitude, the sun still visible on the western horizon, even though it was past midnight Greenwich time. In the cockpit, Captain Lars Weber and First Officer Julia Meyer were 5 hours into a 12-hour flight. They'd traded control at the halfway point, Julia flying now, Lars monitoring systems and eating a sandwich he'd brought from the Frankfurt lounge. They talked the way pilots talk on long-haul flights, about Julia's daughter's upcoming school play, about Lars's plans to rebuild his garage, about whether the catering on the Buenos Aires layover had improved since last month. "Can you pull up the weather over Recife?" Lars asked, wiping mustard off his fingers. Julia tapped the display. "Thunderstorms building, nothing above 35,000. We'll stay clear." In the cabin, 247 passengers arranged themselves across the seats. A Brazilian family of 5 heading home after visiting relatives in Munich. 2 Argentinian businessmen reviewing spreadsheets on their laptops. A young German backpacker who had saved for 3 years to afford this trip. An elderly Italian woman traveling alone, holding a rosary, praying softly even though she would have told you she wasn't particularly religious. The flight attendants began the overnight service, dimming the cabin lights to encourage sleep. The Brazilian mother tucked a blanket around her youngest child. The backpacker put on noise-canceling headphones and closed his eyes. The Italian woman kept praying. In row 27, Margaret Hoffman opened her notebook to a blank page and wrote down the time, 23:47 UTC. Then, underneath it, a note that meant nothing to anyone but her. Cockpit voice, slight irregularity, probably nothing. She underlined probably. Then she ate the last bite of her ham sandwich, folded the wrapper neatly, and tried to sleep. At 00:12 UTC, Captain Weber stopped mid-sentence. He had been explaining something about the garage renovation, something about concrete prices, and then he just stopped. Julia looked over. His face had gone slack, his eyes unfocused. She asked if he was okay. He didn't answer. Then he slumped forward against the instrument panel, his forehead hitting the glare shield with a sound that Julia would remember for the rest of her life. "Captain? Captain." She shook his shoulder. Nothing. His breathing was shallow, irregular. His lips had taken on a faint blue tint that made Julia's stomach drop straight through the floor. She reached for the emergency checklist, her hands already shaking. She had trained for this. Every pilot trained for pilot incapacitation. But training assumes the incapacitated pilot is in the other seat, that someone else is there to take over. that the remaining pilot can handle the aircraft alone while managing the emergency. Lars Weber was the senior captain, the one with 28 years of experience, the one who had handled emergencies before. And now he was unconscious beside her, his body a dead weight against the controls. And Julia had never flown a heavy jet without another pilot in her entire career. She keyed the radio. "Mayday, mayday, mayday, this is Lufthansa 417, captain incapacitated. Request immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport and medical assistance on arrival." The controller's response came back within seconds, professional but tense. "Lufthansa 417, understand captain incapacitated. Nearest suitable is Recife, approximately 400 nautical miles. Can you continue to destination?" "I don't." Julia stopped. She realized she didn't know if she could. She had the training, yes, the hours, yes. But she had never done this alone, and suddenly the cockpit felt enormous and empty, and she was very, very scared. She looked at Lars's unconscious body, at the displays, at the endless dark sky ahead of her. Then she keyed the radio again and said something no first officer ever wants to say. "I need any available controller on this frequency who has experience with emergency situations. I need someone to talk me down." In row 27, Margaret Hoffman's eyes opened. She had been dreaming about the radar room, about Dieter's voice, about transmissions she couldn't quite understand. The passenger address system crackled. The flight attendant's voice was strained. "Is there a doctor on board? We need a doctor to the cockpit, please." Margaret sat up slowly. She looked at Klaus in the window seat, who was watching her with wide eyes. She looked at the notebook in her lap. Then she did something she hadn't done in 9 years. She unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up, and walked forward. "Stay with me here, because what happens in the next few minutes is the part nobody talks about. And once you hear it, you won't be able to forget it. I want you to think about what you would have done in her position. Hold on to that thought." The flight attendant blocking the cockpit door was named Elena, and she had been flying for 11 years. She had seen medical emergencies before. Heart attacks, fainting, once a seizure that turned out to be a passenger faking to get out of a connecting flight. She knew how to handle this. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We have a medical situation and the cockpit is restricted." Margaret didn't stop walking. "I'm not a doctor. I'm an air traffic controller. Retired. Military. They need me on the radio." Elena's face flickered between confusion and professional obstruction. "I'm sorry, but listen to me carefully." Margaret's voice changed. The soft grandmother tone vanished. In its place was something sharp, precise, the voice of someone who had talked fighter pilots through engine fires without raising her voice above a conversational murmur. "The first officer just asked for an emergency controller. She didn't ask for a doctor. She didn't ask for a pilot. She asked for a controller. That's me. Now let me through or I will walk through you. And I guarantee you do not want to explain that to the investigators." Elena stepped aside. The cockpit door opened. Julia Meyer looked up, her face tear-streaked, her hands still on the controls. Behind her, Captain Weber lay slumped in his seat, a flight attendant who had arrived moments earlier trying to check his pulse. "Who are you?" Julia asked. Margaret sat down in the jump seat, pulled out her notebook and opened it to the page where she had written the frequency assignments she had memorized 9 years ago, but could never quite forget. "My name is Margaret Hoffman," she said. "I controlled military traffic out of Rhine Control for 15 years. I've handled more emergencies than I can count. You're going to give me the radio, and I'm going to tell you exactly what to do, and you're going to do it even when you don't want to. Understand?" Julia stared at her, an old woman in sensible shoes with gray hair and a leather notebook. This was not what she had expected. This was not what anyone would have expected. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Margaret reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out an old ID card. Rhine Control Center, German Air Force. Her face, younger, but unmistakably hers. The security hologram caught the cockpit light. "You don't," Margaret said. But your captain is unconscious, you're 400 miles from land, and you just asked for help. So here I am. Now give me the radio." Julia handed her the headset. Margaret put on the headset, and the world changed. It was the same feeling she had experienced every single time she had sat down at a radar console. The sudden shift from being a person to being a system, her senses expanding to include frequencies and transmissions and voices she could not see. The headset smelled like sweat and coffee and the faint chemical tang of cleaning wipes. She did not care. "All stations, this is Lufthansa 417. Captain incapacitated. First Officer Meyer flying. I am a retired military controller on the flight deck assuming communication coordination. Request immediate patch to any military or civilian controller with tactical emergency experience. German or English preferred." Silence. Then a voice she did not expect. "Lufthansa 417, this is Recife Center. I have a retired Brazilian Air Force controller on the line. His name is Eduardo, he speaks English, patching him through." A new voice, older, accented but steady. "Lufthansa 4017, this is Eduardo. I controlled fighters for 22 years. Tell me what you need." Margaret closed her eyes for half a second. 22 years. He would understand. "I need you to watch the big picture," she said. "Weather, traffic, military activity. I need you to see what I can't see from up here. And I need you to tell me if anything changes. The first officer is going to need to focus on flying." "Understood. I have you on radar. Weather clear ahead to Recife. No military activity in your sector. You have time." She turned to Julia. "You heard him. You have time. That's the most important thing I can give you. Time. Now talk to me. What are you seeing?" Julia's voice wavered. "Everything is normal. All systems green. I've never done this alone. I don't know what I don't know." Margaret nodded. That was honest. That was good. Fear that admitted itself was fear she could work with. "You know how to fly the airplane," Margaret said. "You know how to land it. You trained for this even if you never thought you'd need it. Here's what I want you to do. Forget about the captain for now. He's not alone. There's a flight attendant with him. Your job is the airplane. My job is everything else. We do our jobs, everyone gets home, understand?" Julia took a breath, nodded. "Understand. Good. Now tell me your fuel state." They worked through the checklist. Not the printed one, that assumed 2 pilots, assumed a functioning captain, assumed 100 things that weren't true. Margaret built a new checklist in her head, pulling from memory, from experience, from 15 years of building emergency procedures on the fly when the manual didn't cover the situation. Fuel, sufficient for 3 more hours with reserves. Distance to Recife, 2 hours at current speed. They had margin, they had time. "Descend to flight level 300, Eduardo said over the radio. "Lower altitude will be easier on the first officer and gives you options if the weather changes." Margaret relayed the instruction. Julia repeated it back, a habit from training, confirmation that she had heard and understood, and began the descent. The aircraft tilted forward gently. In the cabin, passengers stirred. Some asked questions. Most just looked at the flight attendants with the particular confusion of people who knew something was wrong but didn't know what. "Elena," Margaret said through the cockpit door, "tell them we're making a precautionary descent for weather. Keep them calm. No details about the captain." "How long?" "As long as it takes." The descent took 12 minutes. During that time, Eduardo coordinated with Recife Tower to clear their arrival, arranged for an ambulance to meet the aircraft, and confirmed that the runway was dry with good braking action. Margaret did something else. She listened. She listened to the way Julia breathed. The first officer's inhalations were slightly too fast, her exhalations slightly too forced. Hyperventilation threshold approaching. Margaret had seen it before. Pilots so focused on controlling the aircraft that they forgot to control their own bodies. "Julia," she said quietly, "breathe with me. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. I'm fine. You're not. Do it anyway. Julia's jaw tightened, but she did it. Once, twice, 3 times. Her breathing slowed. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Just fly. 30 minutes from Recife, the weather changed. Eduardo's voice came over the radio, tighter now. Lufthansa 417, I'm showing a storm cell building on your approach path. Nothing severe, but there's turbulence and possible wind shear. Recommend you hold south of the field for 20 minutes or divert to alternate. Margaret looked at Julia. Can you handle turbulence right now? Julia's hands were steady on the yoke, but her eyes were wide. I can handle it. But the captain is unconscious, he won't feel it. The question is whether you can land in wind shear conditions with no backup. Julia didn't answer immediately. She looked at Lars, at the displays, at the dark sky ahead. Then she looked at Margaret. You said you'd tell me what to do, so tell me. Margaret made a decision. It was not a decision anyone would have taught her. It was not in any manual. It came from 15 years of listening to voices on the radio and knowing somehow which pilots could be pushed and which needed to be brought home gently. You're going to land, she said. Not because it's easy, because you're ready. You've been ready. You just didn't know it until now. What if I'm not? Then we find out together. But I don't think that's going to happen. The approach was rough. The storm cell pushed wind across the runway at angles that made Julia work constantly to keep the aircraft aligned. The autopilot was off. She had clicked it off 20 minutes out, needing to feel the controls herself. And every gust demanded correction. Every lull demanded patience. Through it all, Margaret talked. Not instructions. Julia didn't need instructions. She needed a voice that wasn't panicking. She needed someone in her ear who believed she could do this. You're high on the glide slope. Correct left. I see it. Speed's good. 2 degrees nose down. Got it. 500 feet. Runway in sight. You're aligned. I have it. 300, 200, 100, 50, 20, 10. The wheels touched down with a squeal of rubber, firm but controlled. Reverse thrust roared. The aircraft slowed. Julia's hands were still steady. They taxied off the runway and stopped on the taxiway. Emergency vehicles surrounded them, lights flashing, but nobody was hurt. Captain Weber was still unconscious but breathing. The passengers were confused, but safe. Julia put the aircraft in park, set the brake, and then she did something Margaret would never forget. She turned to the old woman in the jump seat, took off her headset and said, I couldn't have done that without you. Margaret took off her own headset. Her ears were ringing. Her hands were shaking now. They hadn't shaken during the emergency, but now they wouldn't stop. You did it yourself, Margaret said. I just listened. The paramedics took Captain Weber to a hospital in Recife. A heart condition, it turned out. He survived. He would fly again, though not for 6 months. Julia Meyer sat in the airport terminal for 3 hours, filling out reports, talking to investigators, calling her daughter to say she was okay. She asked for Margaret's contact information. Margaret gave it to her. They would meet again a few months later in Frankfurt. They would have coffee and not talk about the flight at all, just about Julia's daughter's school play and the weather and ordinary things. The passengers disembarked in Recife, confused and frightened and grateful. Some of them had figured out what happened. The whispers spread, as whispers do, and a few approached Margaret in the terminal to thank her. She accepted their thanks the way she had always accepted medals, politely, briefly, with a slight discomfort that she couldn't quite hide. Klaus, the man from 27C, found her at the baggage carousel. You're not a school teacher, he said. No, Margaret said. I'm not. What are you then? She looked at her notebook, at the frequency assignments written in her own hand, at the note she had scrawled hours ago. Cockpit voice, slight irregularity, probably nothing. I was someone who listened for a living, she said, and tonight someone needed me to listen one more time. She closed the notebook and put it in her pocket. 3 weeks later, Margaret sat in the garden behind her small house in Baden-Württemberg. The winter had been cold, but the spring was coming. The first crocuses had pushed through the soil, purple and white, the same flowers her husband had planted years ago. Her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She almost didn't answer. It was Dieter Wagner, her old instructor. He was 83 now, living in a retirement home near Hamburg. Someone had told him about the flight. He had called to say something Margaret never expected to hear. "I taught you to listen," he said. "But I never taught you to stop. Maybe that was my mistake." "What do you mean?" "Maybe listening isn't something you retire from. Maybe it's something you are, and maybe that's not a burden. Maybe it's just what you have to give." She didn't answer. She looked at the crocuses. If this story moved you, I have more where this came from. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next, and leave a comment below telling me which moment in this story stayed with you. I genuinely want to know. Here's my question for you. Do you think Margaret was ready for that moment? Or do you think the moment made her ready? The crocuses kept growing. The phone went silent, and Margaret Hoffman, who had spent her whole life listening for things other people couldn't hear, sat in her garden and heard nothing at all except the wind moving through the first flowers of spring. And for the first time in 9 years, that was enough.